I Hate Politics is a podcast dedicated to exploring a human activity we love to hate. We look at human life, culture, and economics closest to us, in our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and in our local governments. Together, we will explore how politics is central to getting things done in societies where we treasure diverse views and preferences. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. I've spent my life studying politics, and I know this. Unless we want to live in a dictatorship or monarchy, we are stuck with politics. Politics is more than Trump, Biden, or elections. It's how we fix potholes, make our streets safer, where we put our schools, and decide who goes to them. It's about coming together as a community. It's about us. Let's go find those stories. In this episode, we continue the Americana theme by asking the question whether local governments should allow residents more permissive use of the right-of-way. Right-of-way space is as much a suburban American thing and an artifact of zoning law as sprawl itself. The vast majority of suburban housing stock, single-family homes, the right-of-way sits in front of our homes. Where there are no sidewalks, residents often see their front yard as stretching all the way to the street. If you've been at the receiving end of the glare homeowners reserve for dog walkers, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Even with sidewalks, residents have a responsibility to maintain the right-of-way in front of their homes as they are expected to shovel the sidewalk after a snowstorm. But what you can do in the right-of-way is limited, arcane even. In Montgomery County, fertilized grass is okay, but tomato plants are not. Trees that block the line of sight are okay, but we can't have bushes above 18 inches. Ornamental mailboxes, which are everywhere, are not okay, and the law is not enforced. But now the county is allowing personal electric vehicle chargers to be installed in the right-of-way. To get to the bottom of this, I talked with county resident Will Taylor, who has wrestled with the county's Department of Permitting Services over whether zucchini is a fruit or a vegetable. He was under the impression that fruit plants were okay in the right-of-way, but vegetables were not. Truth is, neither is okay. To find out what is possible and what is not, I talked to Atik Panshiri, the public right-of-way manager in the Department of Permitting Services. And boy, he has some stories. In Bethesda, neighbors hired battling attorneys over a right-of-way garden. Before this explodes your head, two caveats. First, safety is paramount. A right-of-way garden is only a possibility in that strip of land in front of your house, where the county allows trees to be planted already. This is not about the median or even the sides of major streets, where it would be entirely unsafe to garden or impede line of sight. Second caveat, no one is questioning the importance of having rights of way, or that any garden built in the space should not be demolished if the county or the utility company need to get in there. But the county and utility companies leave most residential streets untouched for years on end. Equally, no one is asking to build steps or a retaining wall that can be expensive to remove when it must be removed. Music for this episode comes from exactly 100 years ago, from the soundtrack of the Buster Keaton movie, The Goat. I'll be back with the news roundup. In some Maryland power play, Governor Larry Hogan has put significant pressure on local officials in Frederick and Prince George's counties to support his plan for tolling I 270. State administration officials are saying that the state will lose $6 billion in private financing for transportation projects, including for projects in Frederick and Prince George's, if the public private partnership for the toll lanes does not move forward. Maryland Transportation Secretary Greg Slater has told Maryland lawmakers that the actual impact is about 1.5 billion dollars. In Frederick County, County Executive Jan Gardner, a supporter of the toll lanes, sought and received appointment to the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Council of Governments Transportation Planning Board. Previously, Frederick County was represented by Kai Hagan, a county council member and a strong environmentalist, who, while on the board, sided with Montgomery County Executive Mark Elrich and his efforts to remove the 270 toll lane project from the Regional Transportation Priorities List. With the Transportation Planning Board now reconstituted, Larry Hogan is seeking a return of the toll lanes to the priority list. Montgomery County and Maryland lead the country in vaccination. According to CDC data, almost 90% of all county residents over the age of 12 have been vaccinated. 76% of all residents have received at least one vaccine shot. 69% have received two shots. The consequence is clear. In the entire state of Maryland, unvaccinated persons and only unvaccinated persons accounted for all COVID-related deaths in the month of June. A friend and colleague just returned from a road trip that took them through West Virginia, Ohio, Indiana, Missouri, and Tennessee, and he reports that the cities in those states seem to be doing well, but the rural areas less so. Anti-vaccination and anti-masking remain prevalent. This raises a very important puzzle. Given how important local politics has been in the variability of how the pandemic has affected different parts of the country, how and why do we not pay attention to local politics? MCPS started summer school, and it seems that the process of putting summer school together has pushed up new leaders in the public school system. Jessica Luna, an MCPS teacher, wrote this on her Facebook. 6 weeks ago, I accepted a summer position under the title Virtual Teacher Leader. Little did I know I was going to get training on steroids. In less than 10 school days, a group of about 25 teacher leaders have built a virtual school with 7,000 students from K to 8th grade. We've learned everything from building classes, sectioning students, enrolling, unenrolling, creating a master schedule for specials with about 60 specialists, and for the first time ever, I, along with two other teacher leaders, ran our first team meeting with 60 plus staff members. Some election news. Longtime Montgomery County State's Attorney John McCarthy is being challenged after seeing no contest in 2018. Prince George's County Deputy State's Attorney Perry Paler filed papers this week. He follows Bernice Miracle North, a Silver Spring attorney, Tom DeGonia, a former deputy to Doug Gansler, when Gansler used to be state's attorney in Montgomery County, is also planning to run for state's attorney. All three challengers are running to the left of incumbent John McCarthy, and recognizing this, McCarthy commissioned an independent review of his office to be led by Melba Pearson of Florida International University and Brian Johnson of University of Maryland. The review will cost $500,000, and its report pointedly will be available after the Democratic primary is over. At I Hate Politics, we will not only be covering local and state and some federal races, we are planning a series of in-depth candidate interviews, including, I'm hoping, candidates for state's attorney. Having personally been through the speed dating experience offered by candidate forums, I'm asking candidates to pick a topic that shows them off at their best, and I will interview them in depth on that subject. If you are a candidate or have a favorite candidate, please reach out at ihppod@gmail.com or on Twitter at ihppod. I'll be back with Montgomery County resident Will Taylor. Will Taylor, welcome to I Hate Politics.
Thank you. It is great to be here.
So I hear you were trying to build a garden in your right of way, and the county said no. What's the story?
Back at the beginning of the pandemic, we decided we were going to basically totally redo our yard. We had an old swimming pool in the backyard that we decided to get rid of. And in doing that, we had to have a bunch of dirt trucked into the front yard and had to pretty much replace all the grass there. And I checked with the county before I did that to find out what permits were required. And the only thing they had told me was if I disturbed more than 5,000 square feet of dirt, I needed a permit. And I didn't think I would be. But at any rate, after it was all said and done, I get a knock from someone from the county informing me that someone had contacted them and said that I had been disturbing more than 5,000 square feet of dirt without a permit. So I said, oh, because again, I was aware of the law or the ordinance or whatever it was. And they went out and measured. And apparently I was right at 5,000 square feet. So I said I was okay, but had to do a couple things in terms of runoff. But, it was not a big deal. So that was in the morning. A few hours later, I get a knock from someone else from the county. And they told me to come outside and have a look at my garden with them. So in addition to replanting grass, we had also decided to put in a garden. We put it right next to the road. We don't have sidewalks in our neighborhood. And so we went up to the road. And our thinking was it'd be somewhat of a community garden. People could walk by and, help out in the garden as they saw fit. We thought it'd be a great thing to do for the neighborhood. And this county representative informed me that the garden had to go. We had put in some garden boxes and they informed me that I did not own the front 17 feet of my yard, that it was county property and I could not put anything there except for grass. We had put a lot of time and effort into this garden and it did not make any sense. I understood if the power company had to work on it, they had to have a clear space. So that, I got that I had to get rid of the garden boxes. If a truck had to drive along, that's fine. But the fact that they told me I had to replace it with grass just seemed absolutely nonsensical. So I decided that I was going to look into this a little bit deeper. So I researched the law, which, by the way, was incredibly difficult to find. It wasn't just a Google search that found it. It was like half an hour of searching until I could finally find it. And first of all, it did not say I had to plant grass. It had a whole list of things that I couldn't. Well, it didn't have things that I could plant. It had a list of things that I couldn't plant. It had to be, among other things, drought tolerant. It could not grow above 18 inches unmaintained. So it was not enough to keep it below 18 inches. If you don't touch it and it would grow above 18 inches without doing any maintenance, then you can't have it. And there's a list of other things. But what was most intriguing of all those things was no vegetable plantings, which I found intriguing. And at this point, I was a bit fed up with the rules. So I said, all right, if you're gonna forbid me from planting vegetables, I'm gonna plant fruits. And so I thought, what's a fruit that I could plant? And I had recently learned that a zucchini is, rather than doing something simple like watermelon, which is obviously a fruit, I was going to push back. And so I texted this county official and I said, okay, I read the law and it said that I can put, what I can and can't have. And it says I can't have vegetable planting. So I'm going to plant zucchini. And he responded and he said, okay, that's fine. Good. But at the same time, I'd also emailed like everybody whose email I could find in that department at the county and informed them of my plans. And someone who apparently was higher up in the organization than the person who came and inspected wrote back and said, you cannot do that. And I responded and said, let's look at the law. It says I can't have vegetable plantings. And last time I checked, zucchini is technically a fruit. And she wrote back and she said, we have tried to be accommodating, but you are just trying to be difficult. And then she sent me a link to the USDA, which informed me that although botanically zucchini is a fruit, because it's culinarily treated as a vegetable, for all intents and purposes, it's a vegetable. So she sent me that link and said, no, you can't have a zucchini plant in that front 17 feet of your property. Around the same time, I also got an email, not an email, I read this news article talking about how one of the only legal things you can do during the pandemic was gardening. So a lot of people were taking up gardening, which I found ironic. Because if I got cited, I hadn't been cited at this point, but if I kept it there and got cited, I think they could put a lien against my home for a zucchini plant. So anyway, I wrote my county representatives, and ultimately they wrote a memo to that department asking them to change the law to allow to make a groundbreaking shift and allow vegetables. I don't know if anything came of it, but I've made my difference in Montgomery County. At least I tried.
So you are aware of the laws as they exist. What you're contesting is that the law is incorrect, right? Not that they should not enforce.
Correct. And what really just made me upset was that some anonymous neighbor, because they came and they knocked and they said a neighbor someone has anonymously reported your garden. And it just blew my mind that somebody had enough time on their hands to A, know this law, and B, feel that it was such a public nuisance that they needed to report me. So yeah, I mean, and this is something that just drives me nuts, is I think if a law exists, it should be enforced. But the problem is we have so many laws like this that are selectively enforced that, they don't get changed because they're not enforced until they are enforced. And then it's just ridiculous. And so, and I don't feel like this is the only one. This is the only one I can think of. But there's a lot of these things where everybody like that it's just, well, let's not we'll just turn our head and pretend that this person's not doing this thing even though it's against the law. But again, it's because we have these rules that really shouldn't be there. But again, I agree, if the law is on the books, it should be enforced.
Did you hear back from the county council about changing the law?
No, again, I saw that they forwarded me the memo, but that was the last I heard of it.
So I talked to the Department of Permitting Services, and it's clear that they don't have the resources or the intention even to enforce all these violations, and they only do it when a neighbor complains about them. There are lots of laws like this, and you alluded to that are enforced only when somebody complains about it. Another way to look at that is the glass half full. So there are social norms that are observed in breach by society and not by government. What's wrong with that?
So I think that's a fascinating way to look at it. I think under that is just different worldviews, where some people do view that all laws are meant to be followed, and others view it much more that that you live your life until somebody does something that bothers you, and then you enforce that. And I think the latter, I mean, honestly, that latter view is much makes economic sense, because you can't be having, it's a waste of resources to have everyone out there enforcing those rules. And so I think I like the principle that underscores it, which is, let people live their lives until they're encroaching on someone else. I think there's a couple of things that underlie that and that have to be in place. And one is, I think there has to be a shared understanding that that is the case. There are people in this world that go out and they see something that's against some law that exists, and they feel that it's their right, that it's their responsibility to make sure that if that law is on the books, that it is enforced. There's plenty of violations of this throughout my neighborhood, and there's a part of me that says, well, I can't have my garden, so I'm going to report them. Obviously, I don't do that because I think it's a dumb law, but I think there are people out there that do that. It's just a different outlook in that regard.
If your standard is that we have to have shared understanding, I think that's sort of a really high bar, because you don't have shared understanding and we have diverse preferences. And that's the nature of human life, right? So, how do you get around that?
The solution is that we actually know our neighbors. We don't just share a street name, and that's the only thing. That we go and we get to know them. Well, maybe that person just got cancer and they can't take care of it. Well, if you know your neighbors, then you're going to go help them, and you're not going to report them. But instead, let's say you report them. County comes, makes their lives even more miserable.
So, what have you done to know your neighbors?
So we, thank you. I do need to not just preach this, but practice this. Before the pandemic, we organized a block party. It was great. We went and posted flyers up and on the street and met our neighbors, and it was crazy. But they're like, oh, we used to do this 20 years ago, but we haven't done it in 20 years. And the excitement about it was fantastic.
Are you going to do anything about campaigning to change the gardening law itself?
We ended up planting the garden anyway. We only put like watermelon in the front because I didn't want to lean against my house. And between the deer, the rabbits, the groundhogs, and everything else, we realized that the county is in cahoots with Mother Nature. So they didn't need to put a lien against our house to convince us. They just had to send all the wildlife. So at this point, it's a moot point because we moved the garden to the backyard because we gave up just on our own.
But what about the principle?
The principle is upsetting, but I think there's very few people out there who want to put a garden in their front yard. And of those people, there's very few people who would actually get reported and have to remove it. And I think this is an important principle of democracy and of the model is there's just not enough hours in the day to really care about to do something about all these little things. I think whatever happened that got this rule implemented, somebody was clearly motivated to do it because they probably had a neighbor who wasn't taking care of their garden. And so they maybe had gone on year after year. So they had the motivation to go in there and get that law made. And, I just don't think anybody's motivated enough to remove it. Last year I probably was motivated enough. This year, just, it's one of those things that falls by the wayside. And I think that's how we have so many laws on the books is for every prohibited garden, there's other little rules that somebody really cared enough about that they bothered their elected official enough that they got it on the books, and then everybody forgets it until somebody remembers it and makes somebody like me upset. And then I don't forget about it, but then, I move on with my life. And so we have this, and that's how we have, the county list of county ordinances spans, multiple volumes.
Well, Will Taylor, thank you for that lesson in politics.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
I'll be back with Atik Panchiri of Montgomery County's Department of Permitting Services. Atik Panchiri, welcome to Ahead Politics.
Thank you, Sunil. It's a pleasure to be here and provide some information to our citizens.
What are the rules regarding vegetation in the right-of-way?
The purpose of right-of-way is for public transportation.
Correct.
All modes of transportation, whether it's pedestrian, vehicle, handicap, wheelchairs, strollers, they all have to be accessible and they have to be comfortable to use. And we do have a restriction that is enacted by law, and regulation is in place, what is permitted, what is not permitted within the public right of way. So ground cover, like vegetation, is allowed to a certain limit, and the law is very specific that we cannot allow anything else beyond those things. If you plant bushes and things like that, that does not grow taller than 18 inch and does not require routine maintenance. It's, I guess, environmentally tolerant. They are allowed, as long as it provide access and it is not going to impede people using the right of way. That's basically the rule.
But I have seen trees in the right of way. Are they allowed?
Yes, trees are part of the standard.
Okay.
As far as the vegetation is concerned, um, typically our standard is grass.
Okay. So if as a homeowner, can I put a tree in, can I plant a tree in the right of way in front of my house?
Um, I would say yes, with under a permit. If there's room for it, we under a permit, you could plant trees. If there's no tree and you like to have a tree, you submit application for permit. We look at it and we make sure that it's not going to cause any damage to anything else. You know, Sunil, that we have underground utilities. We have storm drain pipes. We have water and sewers in the right of way. Sometimes it may not be under the roadway, it may not be under the sidewalk, but it would be in the green space. So we have that record. We look at it and say, okay, there's no storm drain, there's no underground utilities. Then we'll say, okay, there's enough space for trees to grow. We'll say, okay, and then we have different type of trees. We have a specific list of acceptable trees within the county. So it's major or minor trees. So if the space is small, you could go and plant small trees that does not grow too big and could cause damage to the roadway, cause damage to the sidewalk. It could heave up sidewalks. You have seen many sidewalks that heaved up because of the tree. So for those three reasons, we look at it, make sure that it's possible. Yeah.
Do you want to tell listeners about where they can find this list of major and minor trees?
Yes, it's if they go to our website, Department of Permitting Services, or they can go to Department of Transportation and look under design standards.
Can you tell me if there's a difference between how the right of way can be used in front of my house on a residential street versus a arterial major roadway such as Rockville Pike or Weir's Mill? What is the difference in the law?
The law does not differentiate between tertiary and secondary or arterial roadway. It's all applies the same, that you do not use the public right of way for personal use or private use. It's for public purpose, and it has to be open at all time for all users, regardless of your mode of transportation.
What are the biggest violations of the right of way that you see, and how do you go about enforcing them?
I would say the major ones, or the one that is putting structures within the public right of way. And
How do you
sometimes
define structure?
anything that is well, there are two types. One is temporary, one is permanent. Temporary is like you have a bench or you have something that you can lift it up and then move it. Those are temporary in nature. But then there's like some people build monumental mailboxes. That is currently is not allowed. I know that there's tons of them in the county. People have built it without a permit. We do not allow it because it's a safety concern. Steps in the right of way. Anything that is a permanent in nature, that the county, the Department of Transportation does not have inventory of those material, is not allowed, because let's say you have one of these beautiful retaining walls that you build it in the right of way, that is going to take away the public access from all users, and it's for personal use, for your use. And that's typically you're blocking everybody else's access. That's not allowed. If we have to go and use it for public purpose, we're going to tear it down, and it's not going to be easy.
Do you see garden violations?
We do see garden violations once in a while.
But they're
Not very,
rare. They're rare.
it's, I would say it's rare. It's not most often. Uh, there was one incident. Well, let me give you an example. It's a good example. It's a it's a community garden in on Massachusetts Avenue, near Wilson Lane in Bethesda. The neighbors came to the county and said, it's okay, it's a paper right of way, it's a lot of trees in there, we would like to have a garden in there. That was probably about 20 years ago. So we issued a permit and said, okay, you can have this limitation, this far and this much. I think it was 20 by 30, within 100 foot of a right of way. So it's, we're thinking it's not gonna hurt anything, and it's for the good of the community. So the garden eventually expanded, and then the neighbors got into it. Oh, there's too much noise. There's, people are coming and going, and it's just, it's become a nuisance to the community. And also they got us involved. They said, okay, what are we going to do? It's a public right of way. We wanted the neighbors to have a good, environment, be friendly. Now they has become that both side has hired attorneys. It's not cheap. So we talked about it, and I visited the site so many times, like 3 or 4 times. The attorneys were there. Our inspection group was there. We talked about it. I said, if you guys don't agree with it, we're going to ask you to remove it.
What did you do?
Well, finally, what the agreement was last year, that it has to go back to the original size. Instead of 40 feet wide, it reduced to 20 feet. And the neighbor that complained, he wanted to plant trees that blocks the view of the garden. He didn't want to see the garden. So we allowed it, and they agreed, and they reduced the size of the garden. They moved the fence around the garden. So it was all good for like a few months. And then recently, I heard back from the other side that complains, oh, this guy plant trees, it's too close to the garden, and it's making, shading the garden, we cannot grow anything. So they hired another attorney, and it's costing them. So finally, I have 2 arborists, they're experts, and with our inspection group, met them on site. So, okay, go ahead, talk to them and say, if you guys don't get along well, then we're going to remove the garden. So they finally agreed that he's going to move the trees closer to his house. So if he needs any kind of screening of the garden or protection for whatever reason, he built a fence around his property. So that cost him money too. So I'm hoping that this was the final resolution that we came together and agreed to it. I hope that goes away, and I don't see it again.
Well, that seems a particular burden, because if residents are going to disagree over what is there, I think, is that the start of an enforcement process usually, that somebody can use it, but if their neighbors object, then it's a problem.
Yes, and it's a public right of way,
Yeah.
and it has a specific for a specific use.
Mhm.
So anything short of that, you need to get a permit, and you also have to have consent of your neighbors. Somebody might come and say, okay, it's a nuisance, it's an eyesore, I don't like it. Why did you allow it? So it's not good for the community. We don't want neighbors to be bickering and fighting with each other while it's not their property and it's county control. So if they complain, we go and make sure that the laws are protected and enforced.
That's very interesting. It seems that your primary method of enforcement starts with a complaint about a violation, which then seems like your enforcement is very selective.
Right.
Is that correct?
You're absolutely right. Unfortunately, we don't have all the resources and the manpower to go and visit every site. And this is Montgomery County is a huge county. It's not as small, so it's not possible and feasible for us to be on the lookout for any violation all the time. If just a common sense, if something is not hurting anything, it's not an eyesore, it's not going to be impeding the purpose of the right of way for use, then I hate to say it, but probably it will get ignored. So, okay, it's not hurting, it's far away, it's not a safety concern, and nobody's complaining. But if their complaints comes in, we are obligated to investigate.
The eyesore standard seems to be a very subjective standard.
It is, and I do agree with you. I don't think that there's a disagreement between us here, because something I see that is beautiful, you may not like it, and that it's ugly looking. That is totally understandable. That's why we have standards. The standards that we have established and what could be in the right of way is very specific. That has gone through the several iteration between the agencies. Everybody gets involved. Okay, this is acceptable, this is not acceptable.
Grass is the worst thing that you could put. Right from my perspective, it's the most polluting thing you could put. If you put a tomato and squash it in the sidewalk or the thing, it's organic, it just goes into the ground. And even if it goes into the stormwater, by the time it gets to, anywhere near, it's disintegrated. Instead, we are okay putting fertilizer to maintain the grass, but not putting a tomato in the right of way. So the tomato or fertilizer, I would choose a tomato every day over fertilizer.
I don't disagree with you, but here's the piece of land, we're talking about a small piece of land. It's not, especially in front of the sidewalk, not behind the sidewalk. Most of it's your private property. And that gets into a little bit disagreement. Let's say you have beautiful plum tomatoes, it looks ripe and it's really good, and I'm gonna come and pick it up. Hey, I'm gonna go and have lunch and it's all good. And then you don't like it because you wasted your time, your resources, somebody else comes and picks it up. And then you get into argument with that guy or with that person. And then it starts with argument and then could go into getting into a fight.
Have you ever got a complaint of theft?
Well, it's not a theft, it's a public space. So
okay. So have you ever got that kind of complaint, is what I'm saying?
No, I don't think so.
Well, I don't think you
I have
would.
not received anything, but
I don't think you would, though.
Let's say an example. I'll give you another example. We are promoting EV charging stations. Electrical vehicles are getting more and more in demand. We established a guideline through the county executive office, and now it's becoming more of a law. We just had the Transportation Environmental Committee reviewed it and they approved it, so it goes to the full council soon, hopefully, that allow this EV charging station within the public right of way. If you do not have a driveway, then and the topography of the land is such that it's not possible to build a driveway, then you could install it in the public right of way. One of the conditions is that this is a public space. The parking space is not yours. If you build your EV charging station and somebody comes and park his vehicle and you don't have access to your EV charging, you cannot enforce the guy to move it because it's public space. It's not your land. So those are the things that I'm saying, that you spend your resources, your money, and somebody else can come and enjoy it.
I think this is a really a question about being a good neighbor. And if you are a good neighbor and you bring everybody along, you can use public space in the neighborhood for the neighborhood. And so long as that happens, you know, then you don't come in. You don't know. You don't come in.
Um, that is true. We don't encourage people to do things without asking, without having a permission. We're not police to say, okay, absolutely, you're not going to do these things. We look at things in the sometimes the most common sense things. It's not like, okay, you have to do it this way, and this is the only way you can do it. I'm not saying that. Perhaps the law needs to be modified and say, okay, under these circumstances, we have to look at it. Under these circumstances, these conditions, if they are met, we're okay with it. So
So tell me, how can the law be modified or the guidance be modified?
it's the laws are made by are approved by the county council. And then the guidelines is authorized by the county law to create conditions. That's a little bit easier than changing the law. So once we have the authority, right now the law is very specific, and we have modified or created the guidelines is standard base of the county code.
Atik Pansheri, thank you for coming on I Hate Politics. I really appreciate
Thank you very
your
much.
clarification.
Well, I hope that it's, anytime people have question, please give us a call.
What lessons should we draw from my conversations with Will Taylor and Atik Pansheri? First, as Will Taylor recognizes, the problem of right of way gardens is probably very small, and we have bigger problems to deal with at the moment. Yet, they seem such an incredible slice, a section of our contemporary problems of political philosophy, that we can't just look away. Consider it a new addition to the pantheon that includes the problem of the lighthouse, or the social cost of lemons, or the pathologies of a two-party system. The problems of the right of way gardens ask questions about how we must deal with our neighbors, no matter if they don't like the tomatoes we plant in the right of way. It raises questions about the nature of lawmaking and enforcement in society. How much enforcement is even possible? As we seek changes in policing, this is a very big question, and it speaks to the cost of political action. Someone was motivated enough to push elected officials to pass a law, but as times change, the law remains in place. The pandemic brought to the fore the open streets movement, where people reclaimed road space from cars. But how do we change the gigantic number of laws that need to be updated? Second, substantially, there is something wrong with the legal standard that prefers grass over vegetables. I want to say that the standard includes drought resistant vegetation. So the expectation is not lush lawn grass we associate with well kept suburban homes. In practice, however, and especially on streets without sidewalks that give the impression that a property line runs right up to the street, the covering is what I'd call golf course grass, maintained with fertilizer and fed lots of water. I can't imagine Department of Permitting Services has ever received a complaint that the grass in the right of way is not drought resistant, or that a homeowner is using too much fertilizer or water in the right of way. In Southern California, maybe, but not here. The law clearly needs to be updated and become more permissive. Perhaps distinguish between major streets and residential roads where line of sight safety is not quite that important. Lastly, there's little denying that the Department of Permitting Services has a reputation for being difficult. But my conversation with Atik Panshiri offers a contrary view. He seemed reasonable and acknowledged the need to update the right of way standards. But he cannot do this himself. The county council has to do it. The county council is updating the right of way guidance on electric vehicle chargers. So they do this all the time. But is updating the rules on right of way gardens important enough right now? Are sufficient number of county residents who have back and front yards to garden already asking county council members to make this change? Probably not. It's probably just easier to bring some tomatoes to your neighbor to make sure they don't complain. That's all for this episode. We use music from the soundtrack of the 1921 Buster Keaton movie, The Goat. One of the great learning experiences for me in doing this podcast has been knowing copyright law in the United States, which can only be described as a hot mess. Sound recordings are the most complicated. Even those that were made 100 years ago remain out of public domain. But in 6 months, on January 1st, 2022, tens of thousands of sound recordings made before 1923 will go into public domain. I can't wait to hear the remixes. In contrast, movies are copyrighted for 100 years, and The Goat is now in public domain. I say this in every episode, but I will say it again. I'm very much looking forward to showcasing local talent, and especially local music students on the podcast. If you want to share your music on the show, or know someone who might want to, please email us at ihppod@gmail.com or reach out on Twitter at ihppod. I hope you will subscribe and share the podcast as we bring you stories about politics close to you and your home. See you next time.